As a preacher, you know. So. I'm going to begin in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 here in just a minute. It's good to see you here for Bible class. See some faces that I didn't see during our first session, so let me just kind of briefly recap where we were. So we kind of have all three of our studies this morning focused around a similar theme. In our first study, we talked about laziness. But this morning, we're going to talk about in our Bible class hour, talk about what it means to be a faithful worker. I'm going to think about the idea of work from a biblical perspective. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the blessing of rest. So laziness, work, and rest. Those are kind of our studies for this morning. And just to kind of summarize the sermon on laziness, the cause of laziness is a desire for comfort. The cost of laziness is your purpose. And the cure for laziness is discipline. And so that's just a very brief recap of a 25-minute sermon, but I'd encourage you, if you would, to go and to listen to that. So I want to now talk about what it means to be a faithful worker. That's something that we should all strive to be, is to be a faithful, hard worker. Let me just go ahead and say this sermon isn't just for those who have a traditional job. Maybe you get up and you go and you spend 40, 50 hours at an office or a job site or out and about doing some sort of in the service industry or something like that. This isn't just for that person. It's for them, but not just for them. This is for the mother that is staying at home raising children, because raising children is full-time work that you can't clock in and out of. It's for children that are pursuing an education that will prepare them for their future. It's for college students who are working on a degree, trying to work on their college education, preparing to one day enter the workforce. It's for men or women who work outside of the home for years and who have invested in their job, and now the time has come where they're supposed to be able to enjoy it. Hey, if you're retired, this sermon about hard work and being a hard worker is for you as well. And so it's really for all of us, no matter where we may be, to examine our life and to think about the situation in which we're finding ourselves, because the reality is, no matter where we may be, whether we're young or old, in the workforce or not, retired, we are all to be busy working. And we're going to begin with this, if that's a strange statement, because you're thinking, okay, I did the work thing, I've retired from that, I've moved on to a different portion of my life. Not so. When you look at the idea of work biblically, and this is where we're going to begin, we're going to think about work from a biblical perspective. I don't know that I've ever really thought about work from the way that God sees it. I think about work as, somebody says, hey, what do you do for a living? What's your job? Somebody asks you that question. In our mind, we get thinking, well, I'm a teacher, or I do construction, or I do landscaping, or I'm a nurse, or I'm a preacher, whatever the case may be. Whenever someone says, what's your job? I'm a homemaker, whatever the case. That's the way we oftentimes think about work. We think about our jobs, our 9 to 5. And while our profession can certainly be categorized as work, work is not just something you do when you're out in the world to earn a living. It's something you do when you're home later that day with your family. It's something you do at night. It's something that you do with your free time. Okay? Work isn't just your 9 to 5. It's raising children. It's keeping the home. It's sharing the gospel. It's going to school. It's serving others. Okay? Work can simply be defined as anything productive that our hand finds to do, whether we're paid for it or whether we're not, whether it's out in the world or whether it's in the home. Work is anything productive that our hand finds to do. And when you think about work from a biblical perspective, it really shifts your understanding, and it should shift the way that you engage in whatever work you are involved in. And so let's start with some very fundamental understandings of thinking about work from a biblical perspective. And the first is this, that our God is a working God. We're going to begin in Genesis chapter 2, and look at a few passages there, and then in Genesis chapter 1. But in Genesis chapter 2, let's read the first 3 verses and see something about the nature of God that we might not have thought about before. Genesis 2, starting in verse 1, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done. And He rested on the seventh day from all the work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. So what are the words that we see so often repeated in Genesis 1 and 2? God created. God made. God spoke. And so what Genesis is very clear about in the very beginning is the things that God was doing as He made the world is described to us as work. He was working. And after God created the world and filled it with every living thing, what are we told that God did on the seventh day? In contrast to His working that He did in the first 6 days. We're told that God rested. He rested on the seventh day, but although God worked the first 6 days and then rested on the seventh, God hasn't since stopped working. Jesus goes on in John chapter 5 and verse 17 to say to His disciples, "My Father is working until now," for He's been working up to this point, "and I am working." Okay, God finished the work of creation. That was something unique that He did to prepare for humanity a place to live. But God then didn't sit back and just sit on His hands and say, "I'm done." This resting thing was on the seventh day. But then guess what? After that seventh day ended, God got to work again. In fact, what do? Well, we see God working in setting forth the plan that was going to result with our salvation. God worked whenever He chose the man Abraham. He picked him out, and then He led him by the hand to the land of promise. And God worked as He took this seed from Abraham, Isaac, and from him He brought Jacob. And then He multiplied them and gave them 12 sons, and He sent them down to Egypt. And He made from the people of God this great nation, this small seed. He made from them a great nation. He caused them to grow. He made them to become rich. He led them back to the land of Canaan and gave it to them, defeating all of their enemies for them. And God's work is going to culminate. As Jesus said, "My Father was working and I'm working," God's work was going to culminate in what was going to result in our salvation, the sending of His Son into the world. And so the story of the Bible begins and is permeated from the beginning to the end to the middle with the working of God. So all of that to just say very concisely, our God is a working God. Secondly, and we need to realize this, that work is not a consequence of the fall. We may think that it is. We might say, why is work so unpleasant? It's a consequence of the fall. But from that we can conclude that work is not. Flip back to Genesis 1 and verse 26 and listen to what we're told here. "Then God said, Let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So if God is the God who works, and we are image bearers of God, then it stands to reason that work is not a consequence of humanity's sin. Well, if that's the case, and look a little further on, verse 28 in chapter 1, "God blessed them, the man and woman, and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So, after making man in this perfect world, God then gives him work to do, to have dominion over the animals, and to care for them, and to tend them, the world that He had made. And that's exactly what we see happening in Genesis 2, where He puts them in the garden, and He says, tend it, take care of it, look after it, have dominion over it. All of those things that Adam and Eve did in this perfect world prior to the entrance of sin and death was work. That was part of God's purpose in making man. God made man to work. Then why does work stink sometimes? Why is it hard? Why is it unpleasant? Why is it laborious? That is because of the curse. Because what happened whenever sin came into the picture? Man was cursed, and for man in particular, by the sweat of your brow will you eat bread. So work becomes hard. What was a blessing given for a blessing for humanity, work is cursed. So man is cursed, woman is cursed, and it's not just them. Who else is cursed? The earth is cursed, so that work becomes hard. And the result of sin is not that we have to work now. The result of sin is that work has become unpleasant. Work has become hard. Rather than yielding to us its strength, the earth rebels against us and it fights against us, so that work is something that is difficult and challenging. It can only be conquered through intense and often unpleasant effort. As God told Adam, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread. And so that's a very brief theology of what lies behind work. That's work from God's perspective. We, as humans, were made to work. And we all understand this fundamentally, don't we? There's nothing that's quite as satisfying or uniquely satisfying as a job well done, right? Whether it's a project that you set out on, and when you finish, there's just a unique satisfaction that comes with it. Even something so simple as working in the flower bed and weeding that, or weeding the garden, or cutting the grass, and you just step back and you look at your work and you just say, that satisfies us on some deep fundamental level as humans. And I can only imagine that must have been what it was like for God after He finished working. So He surveys it in Genesis chapter 1, and what are we told God does? He pronounces it good. God looked at all the things that He had made. God looks at the work of His hands and says, it's good. That's that same feeling of satisfaction as image bearers of God that we have whenever we accomplish a job well done. So we were made to work, and there are a few things that can fulfill us in such a way as work can. And it just reinforces the idea that we were truly made in His image. Now, all of us, that lays the foundation for where we're going now in the remainder of our study. That is, this idea of growing into or becoming a more faithful worker. When you understand work from God's perspective, yes, you don't have to understand it from God's perspective to engage in it and to be good at it. Unbelievers can be hard, faithful, good workers in their chosen fields and in the jobs they do, and even in the extra things that they may take on. But to truly appreciate and find fulfillment in the work that we do, it can only be done when we understand work from God's perspective. And when you understand work from God's perspective, it changes you. It changes your approach to work, and it changes the way that you engage in that and the impact that it has on you. Now, with that being said, let me give you 4 things that we can do so that we might be a more faithful worker. And remember, the scope of work is beyond just our 9 to 5, okay? The scope of work goes beyond what you do for a living. It's anything productive that your hand finds to do. That's work, okay? And so here are 4 things you can do to become a better worker. First of all, work is though for the Lord. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3 real quick. Colossians chapter 3. Now, something that I've come to realize more and more clearly through the years is what I believe used to be a differentiation between the work that Clarence and I do and other preachers. There is no such thing as holy work and secular work under the new covenant as I understand it now. You know, I've had people oftentimes ask me or say to me when they find out that I'm a preacher, oh, I just do an ordinary job. You know, I don't have a holy work like you. I don't see that distinction made under the new covenant. And what I'll tell people is, look, my work my work is holy, but your work's holy too. Just because you're not preaching and teaching, you know, that's not the thing that you have put your hand to do in regard to the Word of God as a preacher or teacher would. Your work is holy. It's set aside for the purposes of God. There is no such thing as common work if you're a Christian. What you do in your work is you do for the Lord. And Paul makes that clear in Colossians 3. Look at verse 22 starting, where he says, slaves, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. Okay, so slaves, they lived in a different world. Slave-master relationship. We might do better to think of that as employee-employer relationship. That's where we'll make the application. So, let's just read it from that perspective. Employees, obey in everything those who are your employers, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Jesus Christ. So, his first instruction that he's given to people who are working, for a master or for us as employees, if we want to think about it in that sense, and whether you work directly for somebody in a company or maybe you hire your services out to somebody else and they pay you for your individual service, you have an employer, someone paying you, someone holding you to a standard expectation for the work that you do, or in any other area. If you're serving someone else, then you might think of, well, they're the one employing me, and they may not be paying me, but I'm working for them. I'm serving them. The things that I'm doing are for their benefit. And his first statement is, don't work to just so pass the eye test. Because that's how we often think about work, isn't it? Whenever the boss is around, he's in the office, we're hard at it. We're focused, and we're making sure not to stretch our breaks too long. But man, when the boss takes a day off or takes a vacation, it's going to be an easy week at work, isn't it? Because he's not around. That accountability is not there. So maybe you push your brakes around a little longer. Maybe you're not as diligent in the work that you're doing as you should be. And so Paul says, as a worker, don't just work in such a way so that you pass the eye test, so that you look busy when the boss comes by. He says, don't do that. He then says, don't just aim to please people with your work. Now, yes, you're working for someone else and you want them to be pleased with it, but the one that we're truly seeking to please with our work isn't people. It's God. And listen, if you're working in such a way, whatever you're doing, so as to please God, then you will, by virtue of that, by virtue of the quality and the diligence and the commitment and the attitude, your work will be pleasing to whoever it is you're working for. I understand you're not going to make everybody happy. That's outside of the scope, really, of this discussion. But if you work in such a way that God would be pleased with your work, then what you're going to find is that those whom you're working for will be pleased. And then he says, whatever you do heartily. Whatever your work you're doing, do heartily. That word there in the original language is the word psyche. And so what Paul has in mind is, whatever you're doing, psyche represents self. Pour yourself into that. Whatever it may be. If it's sweeping floors, or putting on a roof, or mowing yards, or teaching kids, or managing finances for a multi-million-dollar company, whatever it is, work heartily. Do a good job. Pour yourself into that. Don't just give the minimal effort that you can get away with that. Do your best. And so when we put all of these things that Paul is saying together, in your work, do your best. Do your work morally, with integrity, with honesty, without complaining, according to the principles of God's Word. Because when Jesus comes into your life, He don't just change your Sunday and Wednesdays, okay? He changes everything. That includes the way that you work at your 9 to 5. That includes the way you work in your home, with your kids, with your grandkids, with your friends, with your church. God changes the way that we work. Secondly, you think about the men and women that fill the pages of Scripture. One of the things about the most faithful saints you'll see is that they were hard workers. Noah spent 100 years working hard to build the ark. Jacob endured scorching days and freezing cold nights in order to look after his father-in-law's flock. Ruth spent days gleaning in Boaz's field so that she could make sure her mother-in-law was cared for. Peter, Andrew, James, and John spent long nights out fishing on the Sea of Galilee and then would go into market the next day and would sell their catch. But one person that stands out to me as a particularly hard worker is the Apostle Paul. Now, we know that Paul didn't do anything half-heartedly. In fact, Paul regularly speaks about his labor for the Lord. And this is what he says, Colossians 1:29, for this I toil, I work, struggling with all his energy that he works powerfully within me. 1 Corinthians 15:10, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that was in me. So Paul is talking there about his work. And as we think about his life, how dedicated he was. He was the man, he would go out and he would build tents during the day. And then on his days off, he wouldn't kick back his feet and rest like we do. He'd go to the synagogue and he'd preach and he'd teach and he'd stay up late working for the benefit of God's people. And there were two components, though, that I want us to see to Paul's working. There was what Paul did, and there was what God did. From his perspective, Paul said, I toil and struggle. I worked harder than any of the other apostles. That's Paul speaking from his perspective. He was a hard worker. Paul went out every single day and he laid everything on the line in regard to the work that he was doing. But secondly, he acknowledges he labored by God's grace. I struggled with all His energy that He works powerfully within me. I work harder than any of the others, though not I, but the grace of God with me. We will grow into faithful workers when we learn to work by God's grace. Now, some of you may be wondering, what does that mean? Is that like this hidden reservoir of strength that as a Christian I have access to that nobody else does? Those outside of Christ don't? That's not what I think Paul was saying by any means. Part of us working by God's grace is, one, realizing our strength, our efforts, our labors, our mind, they do not come innately from within us. Now, this is true whether a person believes in God or not. The person who doesn't believe, refuses to acknowledge God's existence, if they work, they do so by God's grace. They just don't recognize that and they don't receive the benefit of it. But within us, and I'm talking to believers, within us what we have to resist is the temptation about our work to say, my accomplishments, my mind, my abilities, my talents, my skills, my sacrifice, my work. We have to resist that. Because we're reminded, Deuteronomy 8:18, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gave you the power to get wealth. The only reason that you have the abilities that you do, the only reason that you have the opportunities that you do is because of the grace of God. It's by God's grace that we draw every breath, and if He wanted to, He could take that away from us in a moment. If you were to wake up in the morning and go to work, you do so only because He allowed it. He opens doors, you breathe His air, He gave you your minds, your skills. Yes, like Paul, you had to labor and strive to develop and cultivate them, but He is the source of them. He tells the Corinthians who were boasting about gifts that God had given them, He reminds them, what do you have that you did not receive? And to all of us, I'd say the same. What do you have that you did not receive? What gift, what talent, what ability, what opportunity do you have that God did not give you? None. He gave us all of those things. If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Meaning, why do you act like you did that? God did that. So we work by God's grace when we labor and strive with the recognition that it's He who gives us the talents, the abilities, the health, the strength that we have. And we work by God's grace when we give Him thanks as the source and the originator of all the things that we do. Thirdly, to be a faithful worker, refuse to buy into the lie of retirement. Wait a minute. Isn't that what we spend 40 years working for? So that it used to be 62. Now it's 65. Maybe it'll be 68 or 70, here before too much longer. Isn't that why we work until that age of retirement? So that we can set aside and we strip and we save so that we can kick up our feet and be done working? Oftentimes what happens, and you retire from your physical labor, your professional employment, whatever that may be, nothing wrong with that, but the danger that occurs is physical retirement, and that concept creeps into our spiritual life, and it bleeds into this idea that, hey, I've retired from the work that I did, and so we begin to kind of kick our feet up in the kingdom. And we think that we're retiring from service to God as well. A Christian may retire from their vocation, but listen, you never retire from service to God. God will retire you whenever His work for you is finished. That's what we see in Scripture. Genesis 3:19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread when? Till you're 62 or 65 or 68? Till you return to the ground. Okay? Our life is spent working. Okay? Acts 13:36, for David, after he served the purpose of God in his generation, fell asleep. When did David's life end? It was after he fulfilled God's purpose. Once he had accomplished the work God had given him to do. He labored and he worked all of his life. There was no retirement, and there is no retirement for the people of God. Fourthly, know that your labor is not in vain. We become a faithful worker by realizing this. While on this earth, work can be fulfilling. You invest 40 years of your life in a company. What do you get? A little plaque. Thank you for 40 years of service. And then what happens? They replace you. They get somebody else to do what you did. And you're kind of left feeling like the writer of Ecclesiastes, where he says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, seeing that I must leave it to another man who will come after me. And who knows whether he'll be wise or a fool, yet he may be master of all, for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. This is vanity. So I turned about and gave my heart up in despair over all the toil of my labors under the sun. Think about companies who like Walt Disney and Walmart, Sam Walton and Walt Disney, those men would roll over in their grave if they saw what had become of the empires that they had built, when they see what they represent. As Solomon says, truly, when you look back over the life that you've done, it's vanity. Maybe the guy they hire after you, maybe he's an idiot, maybe he runs the thing into the ground, and all the hard work that you did for 40 years is gone just like that. You understand how physical labor can be very meaningless at the end of the day? And that's why, as I said, when Jesus comes into your life, He changes everything. 1 Corinthians 15:58, Paul says, "Therefore, my beloved brothers, be steadfast and immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord." You want your life to have meaning? You want the things you do, your work, what you put your hand to, you want that to have purpose that goes beyond this physical life? Maybe it's the years you spend at the company. Maybe it's the things you do Monday to Friday. Maybe it's the things you do with your kids when you go home. Maybe it's the things you do within the church. You want that to have meaning. You want that to have purpose. You want to know your labor is not in vain. We all want that. But it can only be done if our labor is done in the Lord. If it's done for self, if it's done for an employer, if it's done for a customer, at the end of the day, we're just spinning our wheels. But if, as Christians, we labor in our service to God, whatever form of labor that may take, it's not in vain. Our work's not common, no matter what it may be. It's not common. It's holy. We are living sacrifices to God. So we labor knowing that the work we're doing is not in vain. Talked about laziness. Talked about working. I hope you'll think about some of these things. We're going to talk about resting in our final lesson. It'd be incomplete without that. But think about your life. And when you think about work from God's perspective, it truly changes things. When you realize to your boss, your employer, you may be just another name, just another face, just another number, just another dollar. But in service to God, your work, whatever it may be, it has purpose that goes beyond this life. And so I hope that you'll give consideration to some of these things as we go about our work. And particularly that we understand the scope of our work. It is not just what we do to provide for our families, but everything that we do that is productive that we put our hand to, we do is considered work and can be a blessing for us, a blessing for others, and pleasing in the sight of God. So let's just carry these thoughts with us into our week and into our life. And when you understand work from God's perspective, hopefully that will change your relationship with that. So you'll work for the Lord. You'll work hard for the Lord. You'll be a good worker for your employee. But ultimately, you'll do so knowing that the Lord is the one you're seeking to please. And that changes everything for us as believers. So thank you for your attention. We'll dismiss for a little while before worship services begins at 11. All right. Vicky, thank you.